Hey everyone, we are now in week 13. So I'm presenting on one of the last topics that we have, which is on language planning and individual mobility and national development. So this is quite an important topic in social linguistics. So first of all, we'll look at which languages is required for mobility and development in the following countries. So these are the following countries. Which language do you think is required for mobility and development? So, for example, in China, Japan, and South Korea, it's very clearly the Chinese, Japanese, and South Korean. And if you look at Malaysia and Indonesia, probably Malay language, to some extent, English, right? So these are the languages which are important. And what about African countries, right? What about Vietnam, and so on? So let's reflect on those. And what are the major trends? The major trends right now will be national unity and national development using the same language. In this case, national language and official language. So in other words, it's nationalization of languages to become official language. So that is the key trend right now in terms of socioeconomic development at a national level. But there are also other trends where they use an exogenous language, both for unity and development. So a language that is not part of the group, not part of the country, okay, not indigenous. So they use that for unity and development. So in other words, a balanced development of dominant L1 and L2 seems to be the major trend nowadays in the context of development. Okay, so apart from these major trends, then we will have to look at some conceptual questions, right? So what do we mean by development? When it comes to social linguistics, we have to look at language for development as well. So how is language related to mobility and development? How about language education, right? And if language is related to mobility and development, which language are we talking about? Which language are we concerned with, right? And what is the relationship between English and economic outcomes, for example? And what do you mean by development, in other words? What about mobility? Why is it important? So these are very important conceptual and substantive questions that we should seek to answer, right? For mobility, we know that people want to move up, right? So there's this upward social mobility, and they want to go up the social ladder. So all of these are important aspects that we need to consider. Okay. And then when it comes to development, we're also talking about development, as in like an increase in prosperity, measured in economic terms. That's what we tend to know, right? That's the neoliberal view. Okay, so the free market rules, states facilitate the whole of market. But at the same time, we have structuralist view as well. So it's individual development, right, leading to growth, right? But we have state intervention as well. So another development is in terms of meeting human needs. Yeah. So meeting the potential of human personality to be realized. So there are two different definitions here by William and Cook in 2002. So what are we doing? We're trying to link language to economic and developmental outcomes, and people do it all the time. For example, saying that English is related to economic development, related to higher education, related to employment, and so on and so forth. Right? So language and development are often linked that way. Okay. So and that leads to us talking about economies of language, right? So there is this thing called interconnections between language and economy. Yeah. So what does it mean? That means we're looking at economic tools, yeah, to talk about language, talk about linguistic variables, yeah, and whether these economic variables actually play a part in determining a language, economies of language. For example, costs and benefits of learning a language, right? Which language is more beneficial? Okay, which language is more economical? Okay, which language gives you a higher economic value, and so on. So there are three main lines of inquiry here. So how do language variables affect economic variables? That's very important. Yeah. And how do these economic variables actually affect linguistic variables? And how is it essential that economic processes affect language processes such as language dynamics, which I've explained a while ago. So there are four direction research if you are interested in research in this area. So language and earning. So some people say the more languages you know, the more you earn. So does learning equals earning? That's debatable, but of course people look into that as well. Or which language actually gets you a higher earning in that sense. and language dynamics, of course, right? So which language is more dynamic from an economic perspective, and then supply and demand in terms of languages, right? All those are economic or linguistic market, which language is more marketable, okay? Which language, if you have the capital, then it will help you to do well in the market, linguistic marketplace, yeah? So language and economic activity, yeah? So which language helps you in the job market, in education, in economy, yeah? And how to evaluate a language policy from an economic point of view, right? What is your return on investment, and so on and so forth. So, and of course, when we talk about economics, we also talk about development, and we talk about globalization as well, right? So globalization, localization of language too. So all of these are also part of language development as well. So these are the people who talk about the critical perspectives of language and development. So they say when a language is developed, then we also have to talk about a different kind of identity, right? Apart from social mobility, we also talk about localization of languages. So Philip Van Parage, Abraham this one, and so on are talking, critical scholars talking about this, right? Apart from Stephen May in 2016. So let's look at this statement by Stephen May, of course. Say that, well, English is a common world language that's undisputed, in other words, but there are ongoing use of local languages, okay? So that we should take into consideration because these languages actually lead to multiculturalism at the micro level, right? So, and then some of these languages are minoritized languages. So that also needs to be looked into, right? And then some of these languages, because of the learning of English, has disadvantaged some of the linguistic speakers of other languages. Okay, so yeah, so those are the other things that we have to consider as well. Okay, so let's respond to this so-called linguistic cosmopolitanism. And how do we respond to this? Well, there are 5 issues here that we need to look at. So we need to address inequalities. That's very common, right? So we address inequalities in society now between the languages as well as between different groups of people. Or we call it unequal Englishes, the book by Ronnie Tupas. And then from language, we now look at language variety. So we have different varieties of languages, right? So language used or language has changed over time, right? Because language has gone through hybridized process, hybridization, okay? Or we have new types of Englishes and new kinds of languages, okay? Varieties, hybrid languages, creoles, and so on. And then we have to look at how these languages have evolved over time, right? Language and mobility. And is it true that with more languages, then you're able to travel? And what is the connection there? And issues of languages of instruction, right? Which should be our main medium of instruction. And of course, multiple language identities now. So we're looking at how language is associated to identity and use, right? Is language part of your regional identity, national identity, and so on? So all of this should be taken into consideration. Of course, we are looking at perception, okay? Perception of the role of language. So as I mentioned just now, what is the role of English in this sense? And it's very dominant currently, the discourses of English as a language of development or as a language for development, right? So within the Saudi Arabian context, within so many different countries, and within Malaysia as well, in terms of Sarawak, in terms of the whole country, right? English seems to be the de facto language of development or language for development. So that's the popular perception right now. So people tend to communicate in English. They want to go for higher education, right? Wider horizon, more opportunities, and maybe better understanding of the world. Yeah, they want to travel. They want to migrate, and so on and so forth. So that's the popular perception, right? And we can look at this, right? So people say learning English will help you earn more money, and that's the perception that people have, right? Between the ages. And interestingly, when they grow older and older, okay, some of them tend to be more skeptical about this, whether English actually helps you develop in your career or English helps you get better job and so on. So that's something interesting, or help you earn more money. Okay, so well, it seems like it's easier to quantify that way English to be associated or equals more earnings or more development. But in fact, it is more nuanced on the ground, and it's not that easy to just associate English with development that way. Okay, so in other words, according to Pegram in 2004, English does bring benefits, but when you deconstruct the discourses, then well, there are some things that English can help. It can be beneficial in some ways, but it doesn't necessarily benefit everyone, or it doesn't benefit everyone equally. In other words. So of course, we look at this. There are many papers written about economics of English, and we are looking at this paper about Vietnamese job market and the demand for English language proficiency in the context of Vietnam. Okay, so and if you're interested, you can go on, and these are the findings. They said many of the jobs require or demanded for English, and in fact, there are more and more jobs, particularly in science and technology, as well as education and healthcare jobs. So very interesting, right? More than 70% require or demand for good command of English language proficiency. So you see, jobs are associated with English language proficiency in some context. And what kind of language do they want or do they need? Is intermediate to advanced level of English. So, and what the job market requires, more listening and speaking and less on reading and writing in terms of English. Okay, so that's based on that research, right? So, and of course, you have another book here, English for Human Capital Development, if you're interested in looking at that. So, English language teaching for human capital development. Okay, so that's the link, right? To what extent that this is true, and some people are looking at it from a critical perspective. So if you're interested, you can look at it from this book, and rather than looking at it from an instrumental perspective, they argue that perhaps it's more, English should be more than just human capital development, and human capital development doesn't mean only English. I think that's the argument that they're trying to make here. These are the references. I think we'll stop there. We'll end there. Thank you very much. So please complete the tasks in e-learning platforms. See you next week. Bye bye. Hope you have enjoyed the lesson today.